So we hear all this talk about mountains and hills. What do you think that's all about? What's the image that you get when you hear the words mountains and hills? High places, right? High places. But specifically, I want you to envision this: a mountain and hills. One is taller than the other. Which outshines the other? Mountain, right? Now here, if you listen to this text, how many mountains are there in this text? One. The mountain of the Lord's house. It will be raised above all other hills, plural. What this is really saying is, all these talk about mountains and hills, the mountain is referring to Jerusalem, Zion, the city of God. The hills are other nations or other gods that are not as tall and not as significant as the mountain where God dwells. This was the basis of theology that we're really reading right here. Ancient Israel, the way people understood God and the way people saw God is that God dwelled on a mountain, which is not a unique motif in the ancient world. We hear of other religious traditions using mountains in similar way, like Mount Olympus. You ever heard of Mount Olympus? In Greek mythology, that's where all the gods dwell. But here in this case, the word mountain is a specific reference to the place where God dwells. What makes this place, Jerusalem, i.e. Zion, the city of God, the most important place on earth is the fact that God dwells there. Now, this is a very different way of looking at God than the way we see God today. We don't believe that God is in one static place, do we? No, what do we believe? That God is everywhere. He is omnipresent. That God is everywhere. But if you go back to the time of even Jesus, people meaning the Jews, believed that God dwelled in Jerusalem. And that's all there was to it. And this is a motif that still runs through today. If you talk to a Jewish person, an Orthodox Jewish person, and ask them where God dwells, what do you think they would say to you? In Jerusalem. We're going to get into that a little bit. But the writer here of Isaiah declares that Zion, the mountain of the Lord, i.e. Jerusalem, is the most important place on the earth because God dwells there. Until in 587 BCE, before Common Era, in 587, the Babylonians came in and destroyed that temple that Solomon built. And when they destroyed the temple, what happened was it created dissonance. People are asking the most fundamental question: if the Lord is our God, how could this happen? If the Lord is our God, how is this possible? It's the same question that people asked when September 11th happened. If God, what the question that they asked wasn't if the Lord is our God. What they asked was if there is a God. You see how the shift happened? The way our thinking is nowadays, as opposed to the thinking was back in the time of this writing. The question they asked was, if the Lord is our God, how could this happen? The question we asked was, if there is a God, how could this happen? So right there you see the shift in the way people think about God. It's not a proprietary inheritance. It's not just exclusive to one group of people. We all saw God as God of all, and people asked, if there is a God at all, how could this thing happen? Well, back then, as it was in 2001, what was the answer? The answer was this. This is a punishment from God for your unfaithfulness. In other words, God allowed the temple to be destroyed because God no longer chooses to dwell there. And why is that? Because of your unfaithfulness. This was the answer. You know what that, in effect, becomes? A prophetic message that says, turn or burn. It scared people straight. Back in 2001, when the World Trade Center and the Pentagon was attacked, people asked, if there is a God, how could this happen? The late, not so great Jerry Falwell was on TV. What did he say? Do you remember? This is a punishment from God for our unfaithfulness. And what did he call unfaithfulness? Issues that were political, abortion, gay rights. That America had lost its way, and God is unhappy with us, and therefore he let this happen. This is the way people explain things. That when bad things happen, we're being punished. But for the Jews, this was a fundamental shift in their thinking about who they are as a people. Because all of their eggs were in this one basket. That God is their God. And God dwells in Jerusalem, their city. And Jerusalem is the most important place on earth. Now, this wasn't the message that was intended, though. If you go back to the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, there was no Jerusalem. But instead, what you saw was not God who was static in one place, but God who traveled and was with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob wherever they went. If you read Genesis, what you'll find is that every time Abraham and Isaac and Jacob moved, the first thing they did when they got to a new place was set up an altar to offer sacrifices of thanksgiving and such to the Lord, right? And that's how they worshiped. They didn't have to go to a place to worship. They worshiped right where they were, understanding that God was with them. But when they moved into Canaan after the Exodus, and they conquered the land and started building a city, especially after David conquered all of Canaan, it was his motive and it was his intention to build a temple for God. And the prophet Nathan basically said, you're not the man. God will not build a temple through you. God will build a temple through your son, Solomon. So that first temple is known as Solomon's temple. And in 587 BCE, before Common Era, the Babylonians came in and destroyed the temple and set the world of the Israelites into a tailspin, forcing them to ask, if the Lord is our God, how could this happen? And the answer, as I said, is that God is no longer with you. God has left the house, he's left the building, and therefore this raises questions in people's mind as to whether or not they're still God's people. And so after 70 years of exile, the Israelites come back. Guess what they did? As soon as they came back, what do you think the first thing they did was? They rebuilt the temple. Now, on some levels, that's a very good thing. On one level, it's reestablishing the ethnic, cultural, and spiritual identity of the people of Israel. Reestablishing their identity and affirming for themselves who they really are. We are still God's people. Yes, God abandoned us and God let us fall to judgment, but now we're back. We're rebuilding the temple to reestablish their prominence as God's chosen people. When September 11th happened and the World Trade Centers fell, what was our first commitment made to ourselves? Yeah, we're going to rebuild it bigger and better than before. And when the terrorists hit us, what were they trying to do? They were trying to buckle the economic legs under us and disrupt our economy to create chaos. So our commitment was, let's rebuild the center of our economic power to reassert our dominance in this global community as an economic powerhouse. Now, if you go into New York, what do you have? A new building. And what does it represent? Our economic dominance, our economic supremacy. It's no different than what the Israelites did. They went back and rebuilt the temple to reassert their dominance as the people of God, the chosen people. Until in 70 AD, the Romans came in and destroyed that temple too. But still, if you talk to someone who is an Orthodox Jew today and ask them, where does God dwell? They'll tell you, Jerusalem. The only part of the second temple, called Nehemiah's temple, the only part of that temple that's still remaining today, 2,000 years after, is what they call the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, where people go and they pray at the Wailing Wall and they worship God there because they believe that God dwells there in that leftover piece of a wall of the temple that existed 2,000 years ago. Now, there were plenty of signs along the way in the Old Testament to point God's people in the right direction in terms of how they should relate to God. I just mentioned to you Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and how their relationship with God looked. There were plenty of signs along the way, but for whatever reason, people chose to ignore those signs. Until even Jesus came and preached the message of God's presence among us. The most famous story of this that personifies this message is told in John chapter 4 when Jesus comes upon a town. He sits down at this well and he says to his disciples, "Can you just go and get some food? I'm just going to sit here and wait for you." And while he is waiting, a woman comes to the well to draw water. It was a Samaritan woman, a people who were despised by the Jews, but who still worshiped God. And after a course of discussion, it's revealed to this woman that Jesus is a great man, a prophet. So she asks him this question. She said, "Why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship?" Again, reflecting that idea that God dwells in Jerusalem and only in Jerusalem. So this woman is saying that outright. Why do you Jews claim that the only place of worship is in Jerusalem? Jesus replied this way. He said, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. Now, this mountain that he's referring to is Mount Gerizim, where the Samaritans worshipped God, not the other mountain, Zion, where the Jews worshipped God. But what Jesus says here is very important. It's a theological, spiritual shift. Jesus is saying it doesn't matter whether or not you worship God on that mountain or in Jerusalem, because God is everywhere. In simple terms, what Jesus is saying and what the prophets have been saying, what the Old Testament has been saying all along is that God is not in a box. God does not dwell in a box. God is everywhere. But for whatever reason, as I said, people did not get that message. And even as Jesus came and preached this over and over and over again, offering forgiveness and grace to the least of these, offering forgiveness and grace to people who are outcasts, that the Jews would never offer grace and peace and forgiveness to, they still didn't get it. They still didn't get it. The message was very simple. You cannot put God in a box. He is everywhere. Why is this good news? Because in the old way of looking at it, you had to pursue God. You had to make yourself right with God. If you wanted to worship God, what did you do back in the day? You went to Jerusalem. Worship anywhere else was not worship. So year after year, faithful Jews would make pilgrimages to Jerusalem to worship once a year, offer their prayers, offer their sacrifices once a year, because their thinking was God dwells in Jerusalem. But Jesus' message was no. God is everywhere. And this is good news because as long as God is boxed in a static location, He is only the God for people who seek Him out, who make the effort to go to Jerusalem. But the fact is, if God is everywhere, He is the God of all. He is the God of you. He is the God of me. He is the God of the Muslim, the Hindu, the Buddhist, the atheist, the agnostic. He is the God of the heterosexual. He is the God of the homosexual. He is the God of this culture. He is the God of that culture. He is the God of all, because God is everywhere. If you believe that God is static in one place, you could make very strong arguments of exclusion. He is not your God because you're a woman. He is not your God because of the color of your skin. He is not your God because of the things that you've done in the past. He is not your God because of the things that you will do in the future. He is not your God for this reason, and for this reason. But if God is everywhere, He is the God of all. And God is to be worshipped in all places. Here's the good news. In this modality, it is not that we are with God. You know that saying, are you with me or you're not with me, right? It is not that we are with God. The good news that in Jesus, Emmanuel, God is with us. Do you understand that? We don't have to go searching for God. We don't have to go chasing after God because God in Emmanuel is with us. In other words, God is pursuing us, not the other way around. Let me put it to you another way. If God is pursuing us, it doesn't matter where you go, God is with you. It doesn't matter what you've done, God is with you. It doesn't matter where you come from, God has been with you. The purpose of our faith, the reason we say we are a people of faith is because we trust in this fundamental principle of faith. Fear not, for I am with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. This is what it looks like in real life. If you're depressed, if you're worried, if you're anxious, if you're troubled, if you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death itself, we remember these words, fear not, for I am with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. The psalmist even says, even if I go to the ends of the earth, even if I go into the deepest part of the darkest hell, even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will uphold me. Why do you have faith if it's not to help you connect with that promise that you are not alone? The message of Advent, the message of Christmas is this, that you are not alone. Jesus, God, Emmanuel, God who is with us, not the other way around. That's what faith is about. Knowing and trusting that we are not alone and God is with us. That's what faith is about. And he who has faith has hope. And he who has hope has everything.